So this morning we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 2 to begin with. And as I just mentioned in a prayer there, we're going to be looking at the sons of Eli. Eli was the judge, if you will, of Israel, but also the priest, and it was his family line that were serving in the tabernacle of Israel. And young Samuel has just been dedicated to the Lord, and having been weaned by his mother Hannah, who had been barren and who had prayed to God that she might have a son, and that if God answered her prayer, then she was willing to give him to the Lord's service for the duration of his life. And so that's all just happened, and now Samuel, this young lad, is in the temple precinct, or the tabernacle, which is at Shiloh at this time. It's not yet gone to Jerusalem, and he is serving under Eli. And Eli's sons, Hophni and Phineas, are more or less doing the hard work. Eli's getting older. If you remember much about the priesthood and the age that you went into active service as a priest was, I think it was 20 years old, and you'd served till you were 50. That doesn't seem like a very old age before retirement. But I'd like you to just think about what goes on in preparing sacrifices. What modern day, I wouldn't say profession, but job would be more associated.
Working in a slaughterhouse.
Yeah, you're a butcher, basically. You're carrying heavy sides of animals around, you're chopping those things up, and if you've ever tried to chop a side of cow up or whatever, or hog, it's hard work.
I have heard that killing animals is a soul killing job, that they have to rotate the guy that actually kills the cows. I guess it could be a woman, but
yeah,
that so much death.
Yeah.
What are you doing all day? I'm killing animals.
Well, it's so much death, but it's the smell of death as well, blood.
That's true. But you think about, what do you do all day? Well, yes, you butcher,
mm-hmm.
but you kill them. You slit their throats, you do whatever all day, every day.
Yeah. Well, when you come to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, man, then it really gets busy. Yeah. Rivers of blood almost, as they say about it, flowing down to the Kidron Brook in Jerusalem. Always remember Latane Scott's poem in some of the songbooks that we have. It's number 374. I remember it very well. I've used it a number of times in communion talks. But she describes, Passover in the time of Jesus. So something like 150,000 lambs are going to be slaughtered that day. That's beyond understanding, isn't it? I mean, goodness me. The squealing. I always remember when we were in Italy, there was a farmer who had a couple of hogs across from where our balcony was. And right before Christmas each year, that Saturday, the nearest Saturday to Christmas, you were going to hear the squealing as they killed one of the hogs. Mm-hmm. And boy, you'd never heard of squealing until you heard them put a hog down. But I don't think we kind of really register. But we don't really register what priests are like either, because priests are oftentimes fairly sort of ordinary and somewhat effeminate almost in their garb, where I come from in England. They're not, in the 1800s and the early 1900s, the families that provided the priest. It was usually the son that wasn't able to go off to war and become a captain or become something big. It was the black sheep of the family became the priest, and so they gain a very different view or perception in their minds. But these guys, I guarantee you, they are well built, they are strong, they would go into battle, and I guarantee you they went in armed and they were feared, quite a few of them. These are not wimps, these are strong guys. And so 30 years of doing that was probably all you needed. They were ready to retire by 50. Anyway, I introduced that because I'm trying to build a perception in your mind, not only of Hophni and Phineas, but also we're going to hear about some young guys. They are novices. They are new into this priesthood, so they're probably around 20 years old. Okay, but they're not little wimps either. These are strapping lads, and they're certainly going to become more so. So I give you that to introduce the passage we're going to look at to begin with, and it begins in 1 Samuel 2 verse 12. I'm just going to read it, so follow along. Now the sons of Eli, and I'm reading from the English Standard Version, so you may have one or two different words. Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. I think King James says sons of Belial. And that word Belial translates most accurately as worthless. Okay, it's not a name in that sense. They did not know the Lord. Did you catch that? These are the priests, and they did not know the Lord. So that tells you, that sets the scene for where all Israel is, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Now, the custom of the priests with the people was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest's servant, this is the novice, would come while the meat was boiling, and he would take a three-pronged fork in his hand, and he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. All that the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is what they did at Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Moreover, before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, "Give meat for the priest to roast, for he will not accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." And if the man said to him, "Let them burn the fat first, and then take as much as you wish," he would say, "No, you must give it now, and if not, I'll take it by force." Thus the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord, for the men treated the offering of the Lord with contempt. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with the sack system, the sacrificial system that's described in a lot of detail in Leviticus. But what strikes you here? Why are they holding the Lord's sacrifices in contempt?
They don't respect God.
Yeah. Not all of the sacrifices were to be any portion. They didn't. Some sacrifices, like the burnt offering, were a whole burnt offering to God. Okay, but in the other sacrifices, for the guilt offerings, sin offerings, a portion was prescribed for the priest. Yeah. And I think it was as a wave offering, it was one of the breasts or one of the legs was the priest's portion. And that was, I think you can look at that in Leviticus 7, not sure the verse, somewhere around verse 30. But those were prescribed portions of various sacrifices, and some sacrifices it was a different portion. So the priests weren't forgotten, and that was understood. So what's going on here when it says it was the custom of the priests? This is like Jesus saying, well, you follow the traditions of your fathers and not God's word. That's kind of what's going on here. They've changed the rules. They're probably taking their wave offering and their thigh or whatever and the breast that they would prescribe, but then they want to do this as well. And another thing, who does the fat of all these offerings belong to? Who's to get the fat?
That's really what got burned, wasn't it?
Yeah, but that was the part that was for God. That was the olam, the sweet aroma that went up to God, was the fat portion. And that wasn't to be touched by the man. And what did this young priest say to someone who was offering his sacrifice and his fatted portions to God? He was saying, I don't want that cooked. He's saying, I need to cook the fat because otherwise my offering won't be pleasing to God, and that will bring guilt on me, not just you. So they're trying to tell the priest what God really wants, reminding them, and the priest is saying, you give me the raw portion now. Okay, and if you don't, I'm going to take it by force. And just remember, these guys are going to look fairly threatening. They're not wimps. And he's got a 3-pronged fork. Do you think that's a little 3-pronged fork, or do you think that's a great big thing? I think
One
it's
that
a
can
pretty
actually
big
pick
thing.
up an animal.
Yeah, and he's going to ram that thing down in the cauldron, and he's going to pull out a big portion. Trust me. And so, so what's going on here is very contemptible in God's sight, because the sacrifices and that system of the sacrifices under the covenant with Israel is how God is doing fellowship with his people, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
They need forgiveness. They stand in the need of forgiveness every day like you and I do. And this is the system that allows fellowship to exist as long as they follow the covenant. Well, if you're, let me call them chief priests, are just making a mockery of the whole system, it kind of reminds me of God's scorn on the people through Malachi. You remember Malachi? Because they were doing something different there, but similar. They were offering diseased animals instead of an animal that was supposed to be without disease, that wasn't lame or any other problem. And he told them, no uncertain terms, that you'll go and offer that to your governor and see what he thinks of it. I guarantee you, he won't be pleased. So what do you think I am? Do you think I'm pleased with that? You're holding my whole system in contempt. So it was a very great sin. That's what he said there in verse 17. So when the leaders are bad, what's more than likely going to happen to the people of Israel?
Yeah.
Under this system, you got a bad leader. I mean, you haven't got the kings yet.
Yeah.
But that's the lesson of Kings, isn't it? And Chronicles is if you have a bad king, you're going to have a bad populace.
Yeah, you follow the leader. I mean, what if the leader lies and does things incorrectly and doesn't respect the people, then they're not going to.
Right. And if you rule with the threat of using force as well to get your way, that makes it even harder for people, because they can't be just conscientious objectors anymore. Now,
To defend themselves.
they don't really have a means to defend themselves, and especially when you've got these big brutes bullying you, it becomes very difficult. So the sin has become very great, not just on the priesthood, but through the priesthood onto all the people. And we see how that plays out, because the Philistines come to attack Israel, and that's described in chapter 4. And there'll be a battle, initial battle, and some 3,000 or 4,000 men are going to fall, and Philistines take the day. And so they go back to their camp because the battle's going to continue. But Israel's thinking, what have we done? Why is the Lord fighting against us? Well, do you not know what your priesthood's doing?
Mm-hmm.
And so what do? being a superstitious lot, they decide to bring the Ark of the Covenant to the battle lines, if you like. Tomorrow we're going to take the Ark in with us because it will save us.
That's an interesting manipulation. I just now thought about that. Because
Yeah.
I always thought, oh, we'll bring the Ark and our enemies will cower. But that's kind of surely God won't let the Philistines take the Ark. In other words, we'll force God's hand here.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some of that going on. I don't know whether they're venerating the Ark, kind of like the Catholics would, but they're definitely, believing that this is going to turn. We'll put God's arm up his back a bit, and we'll see whether this sorts the day for us. Well, what happened the next day? As had been prophesied by a man of God who'd come to Eli, they go into battle. They lose 30,000 men or more. The Ark is captured by the Philistines. It's taken by them. And that is the worst thing that can happen to Israel. That's like losing the temple. Losing the Ark of the Covenant is like losing the temple to these people. And so, something else happens as well. Both Hophni and Phineas are killed on the same day, which is what the man of God prophesied to Eli. One of the questions that one has to draw from this, because not only were they showing contempt for God's sacrifices, we're also told a little later on here, where is it? Well, let's look on down a bit. Yeah, verse 22. Now, I'm back in 1 Samuel 2. Now, Eli was very old. I would say he's in his late 90s. And he kept hearing all that his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they lay with the women who were serving at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So here's another heinous sin that they are transpiring or causing to happen. He's known about this for at least 20 years. Okay, his sons have been doing this. Why has Eli never, ever gone to his sons and rebuked them before now?
He never has. I mean, he spoiled them from when they were children.
You think? Do you think that explains, is that the only thing that explains why Hophni and Phineas have turned out the way that they have?
Well, we're all responsible for our actions before God.
We are.
So, but life is complicated. Understanding why you've done something that brings you under the judgment of God is smart. And there's a difference between, okay, this is this, that, and the other. This is the baggage that I kind of came in with. It's my baggage now.
Yeah.
But, you really do wonder what kind of dad was he. And I've heard, that is a sermon thing that you hear once in a while about, let's study great men of God who didn't raise good sons or didn't.
It happened a lot, didn't it?
Yeah.
It still happens a lot, by the way.
Yeah, well, it's
let me just share one other with you.
I don't know, sometimes I think sometimes you expect just because they're your kids, they'll do what's right. And you don't actually have to teach them. And
osmosis.
Sometimes it's not just the teaching. The hardest part of being a parent is the disciplining.
Yeah.
Because disciplining, it truly is. It hurts. It is hard to discipline. And it seems like Eli wasn't there to discipline his kids.
because he has responsibilities with
one of the reasons
and
is
he's going like,
because he's a judge of Israel, he had to go on the circuit like Samuel will have to do. And so he's not there a lot of the time.
Mhm.
And so he needs other people to do that. Maybe they were remiss in not disciplining the children.
Yeah.
Before Eli dies, when he hears news of this battle, of this great defeat, he sat on a chair on the side of the road.
Wondering if that wasn't
Yeah, and
his neck.
he's described as old and heavy. So I'm pretty sure that Eli is enjoying the meat that they're also taking out of the cauldron. He's a participant,
Yeah.
if not directly, but he likes his food. He's a big guy. And when he hears that both his sons have been killed in battle on the same day and knows the prophecy's been fulfilled, it says he fell back off his chair and broke his neck and died as well. So all the prophecy that was given to him was fulfilled. And when he's told that what will happen to his sons, his response is, let the Lord do what seems right to him. It's not that Eli is outwardly evil like his sons, because he's given the responsibility of raising Samuel in the temple, and he obviously does a good job at that. But it's the areas of his responsibility that he has negated. That he's I can't think of the word I'm looking for. He's just not there. He wasn't there as a father.
Mhm. Well, and if the sons are taking the meat that they aren't supposed to, then they may have seen their father do that as well.
You really do wonder, where did you think that level of disrespect comes from? It's odd, because last week I felt the same way. It's kind of like Dale setting up the Bible classes.
Yeah, for his sermons.
Because, it's kind of like he's
more at work than you think in that.
Well, it could be, because he's teeing that up. Because I'm sitting here listening to this, and I'm thinking about what he said this morning about respect and lack of respect. Because that you could sum everything up into lack of respect. But he talks about Saul being God's anointed, which we talked about last week.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Eli was God's anointed.
Mm-hmm. As his judge, yes.
And so, being God's anointed, Saul being God's anointed didn't stop Saul from making big mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point then, so maybe Eli being God's anointed didn't stop him from making mistakes. It's like, where did they learn? How can I make a buck off this job? Because that was basically, it's kind of like, how can I use this job to my advantage?
Mm.
And they took it to extremes.
I have to work hard cutting all these animals up. I'm going to
eat good stuff. I'm going to broil. I'm going to eat good stuff.
Yeah.
And
it's probably a whole bunch of those things all sort of coming together over time. The word that describes Saul's behavior is presumptuous. It was presumptuous. And I wonder whether presumptuousness doesn't come into the behavior of some of God's people.
And we're talking about a man who hid when he heard he was going to be king.
Mm.
Remember how humble Saul was.
Well, he came from the smallest tribe and the smallest family within that tribe. So he was from humble beginnings. The only thing that he had that was greater than anyone else was he was a very tall guy, wasn't he?
Mhm.
He was probably about 6
He
feet
looked
10.
like a king.
Right.
Yeah.
You were a big fella. Yeah, good point.
Well, I just think of power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolute.
Yeah, true. Samuel was a righteous man. he judged Israel all the days of his life, 1 Samuel 7:15, and he went on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mishpah. And he judged Israel in all these places. Then he would return to Ramah, for his home was there, and there he also judged Israel. So he was not around a lot of the time. And somewhere around here, I'm trying to remember where the passage is, it tells us about Samuel's sons. Because he had 2 sons, and when he was older, he would send his sons on the circuit to go and judge for him. But they were not righteous like Samuel, because they would take bribes. And that caused a lot of problems in Israel as well. And yet they were Samuel's sons, so I wonder whether him not being around as much as he needed to be in the earlier years caused that to happen. Or did the sons just presume that because father was Samuel, that gave them an entitlement? And there's a word that's more familiar to us in this day and age. An entitled generation becomes a generation that is spoilt and believes that they deserve things without ever having to do anything to earn them. And that is a recipe for disaster as well. Maybe we are living through those times.
Reap what you sow.
Yeah, it's not a good situation. Because entitled kids, when they don't get what they want, when they want it, what's their normal response? What do they normally
Act out.
act out, don't they? Throw a tantrum, throw the rattle out of the pram or whatever. And or they go out in the streets and start rioting and destroying things that they have no right to go and destroy. So all that kind of deal, I see maybe being prevalent in the hearts of the people of Israel. They've become a pretty spoiled bunch. They've also been a downtrodden bunch in respect to things that relate to their means of access to God, which is where the priesthood plays that vital role under this covenant. Not so us today. Maybe we should thank God for that, a different covenant for us. Because He made a covenant with us individually through Jesus Christ, not as a nation needing a priesthood.
The symbolism of the veil of the temple being rent when Jesus died.
Amen. Yes, very good point. So, again, how did Hophni and Phineas become the way they were? Probably a sense of entitlement seems to be there, and for Eli to know of this, for it to have been more than just rumor, and what they were doing with the maidens that were serving at the tent of the entrance to the tent, and I'm not sure. There's not so much about that role in Scripture. So whether that became a tradition as well. I mean, anything to do with the temple itself or the tabernacle was a men-only thing normally. So I'm not quite sure how these maidens, how that transpired, how that became a custom. I don't know very much about that. But anyway, they used it and abused it, is what happened. And Eli knew about this for a long, long time, and he chose to do nothing about it. He chose not to confront them. Well, if you don't confront someone about their sin, and you just sort of turn a blind eye to it for a long time, when you do finally get provoked enough to go and confront them sometime later, or as in this case, years later, what is the possibility of you being really listened to?
Not very. Like that was.
I mean, there's almost
10 years ago. What's the point?
Yeah, they just, look at their father and sort of, you never said anything about it before, so
Well, we don't know that.
Okay.
We don't know that. I mean, you know, what are we told? He confronted them.
Uh-huh.
You know, there's no pre-story here. We don't, all we know is it got so bad. We don't know if he brought it up a time or two before this. We just know that it had gotten so egregious that he confronted them here.
Okay. Well, it does say in towards the end of chapter 2. Let me read from 27. There came a man of God to Eli and said to him, "Thus the Lord has said, did I indeed reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt, subject to the house of Pharaoh? Did I choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar to burn incense, to wear an ephod before me? I gave to the house of your father all my offerings by fire from the people of Israel. Why then do you scorn my sacrifices and my offerings that I commanded, and honor your sons above me by fattening yourselves on the choicest parts of every offering of my people Israel? Therefore the Lord God of Israel declares," and this is where he says, you know, what's going to happen to him as a result.
So maybe I'm wrong, but because what the priest is saying is you're complicit.
Well, this is the man of God. This is a prophet that God sends to Eli. So he's reprimanding and rebuking Eli. But Eli does finally go to his sons. And he's going to, the ultimate result of this is the whole of his family line will be stopped from serving God in the future. And that happens a few years later. But he does go to his sons, but his sons just don't listen to him at all. I'm looking for the scripture now, I can't find it. Chapter 3. Verse 13, I declare to him that I'm about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, is the word he uses there, doing blasphemies, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever. That's a damning indictment, isn't it? Especially to the ears of a priest, because if his sacrifices cannot atone for his sin, then he stands hopeless, doesn't he? And that's exactly what God says to the house of Eli. No forgiveness for his priesthood. And if there's no forgiveness for his priesthood, pray tell me, what forgiveness can there be for the people? So it's a sorry state of affairs for Israel, isn't it? Because of their sin and because Eli refused to confront his sons. He could have dismissed his sons, couldn't he? Mm-hmm. For the sins they did, he could have had them put to death and had them replaced by others to serve in the temple, but he chose not to. And what God says to him is that he loved his sons more than he loved God. Wow. God needs to be first, doesn't he? In all things. What is it? Matthew 6:33 tells us, seek first who? Yeah. You know, that brings me to a sort of a final point. Why do you go to church today? Why do you come to worship? Is it because God is truly first in your life? Do some people come to church because, I've heard people say this over and over again, well, we think this is a good congregation for our children, to raise our children in. Yeah, I understand that, And that's a good reason to come to church, but it shouldn't be the primary reason. The primary reason that you should come to church is because you want to put God first in your life. You come to give him worship. You hear people saying, I come to worship because I like the worship style here, or I like the preacher. Well, if he's the main reason you're coming to church, that's not the right reason.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Because the preacher can't save you. The style of worship can't save you. Only God can save you. And if you're not coming to church to be edified, to build a relationship with, and if that edification of everything else, the people at church, the worship and the preaching, if that edification isn't helping you to grow in a relationship between you and God through Jesus Christ, then the reason you're coming to church is wrong. Okay, and you need help in that. And that's what elders, shepherds, and ministers should be focusing on, and teachers as well. As a preacher for some 15 years, I would say to people, don't put me on a pedestal. Don't come here and don't thank me for the sermon that I've just preached, unless it's helping you in your relationship to grow in a relationship with God and with Jesus Christ. Then I am not doing my job right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm not here for you to worship me. I'm here for you to worship Jesus. And if I can help you do that better, then great. I'm doing my job.
Who was the famous English Baptist minister? And I cannot think of his name.
Yes. Not
Spurgeon. Was it Charles Spurgeon?
Yes. Charles
And one of the stories is as he was coming down, one of the people said, "Oh, that was a really great sermon today." And he said, "Yeah, Satan's already told me that."
Good point. Yeah. If you've ever flown on an aeroplane, okay, and you get that safety procedure told you before you take off each time, one of the things they tell you is, if in the event of the cabin depressurizing,
right,
oxygen mask will drop down from the ceiling here. And what do they tell you?
Put yours on first.
Yeah, if you've got kids, put your own mask on first before you put your children's on. Because if you're faffing around trying to get the child's mask on and not taking care of yourself, what use are you going to be to your kid?
You pass out, nobody gets a mask.
Yeah, and you're dead. If you pass out, you're done. So you must take care of your own spiritual needs first before you can be of any real help to anyone else, whether that be your children or anyone else in the body.
People they don't watch you just at church. They watch you every day.
Mm.
And it's your actions every day that matter.
Right. So I think those are good lessons that we can take from this sad and sorry episode in the history of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason why, somewhere about that much of our Bibles is the Old Testament, the big portion there. The history of Israel is like the history of no other nation recorded, because it records all the bad as well as all the good, and I promise you about 80% of it bad.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and it's from those things that we can profit the most. So I like this study. The guy's book is only about that thick, but it could become many volumes because good lessons from bad guys is pretty much how we learn it. So I don't know whether there's any other comments. What happens to get the ark back is kind of funny.
Yeah.
Because the Philistines
you're a
end up
Philistine.
bringing it back on a holy cart,
But you're
whatever they consider holy,
Yeah.
because he'd given hemorrhoids to the whole of the Philistine army, and I mean it was
It causes them all,
bad
and they obviously have followed the Israelites long enough. They know what's causing them trouble.
Yeah, they do. They soon get it. I mean, it goes from one city to the next, and all it does is bring curses on.
Well, it says in 4, and it's a lot. If I ever knew it, I didn't. But they were originally cowed. What's the word? But they were like, oh no, this is the Philistines were like, oh, this is the ark. This is oh, bad things have happened to people that fought against the ark, and so they had to kind of bootstrap themselves, and then they won. So they were, whatever the word, intimidated.
They were intimidated to begin with, because they heard a great shout in the camp of the Hebrews, and they said, what can this be? This must be a god that's come into their camp, and that's never happened before. It's there in the text.
So then they thought they were going to win.
Someone said, gird yourselves like men and fight, and they did, and they won the day, because God wasn't fighting for Israel. How many times was it Jehoshaphat, the king, who, in a time when they were about to be attacked by a number of nations at once, I think Moab and all those Ammonites, they all got together to take out Israel, and he went and bowed before God and repented for himself and for Israel, and God said to him, just go out there, stand and watch me destroy the enemy. And sure enough, it happened. So it's not that they didn't know what to do, and it's not that the enemies didn't know what they were up against.
Yeah,
they did. They heard. What kind of news travels fastest? And what kind of news tends to be predominant? Bad news, isn't it? So when King of Arad got destroyed by, they lost 10,000 men and Israel didn't lose one, or whatever trust me, that news got around all the other nations. All the other kings, they heard about it. They knew that you were a fool if you took on Israel. You better know what you were up against. So, but if you knew that God wasn't for Israel because they were and it become an evil people, then your chances were much better. I don't know whether Philistines knew that on this occasion. They were fighting. They would be the nemesis, really, of Israel through several hundred years, until David routed them. But it's interesting. There's a lot that we can gather from. I've done a study and taught it on the Kings and the Chronicles. Why do we have all these accounts, all these kings in here? Well, if you look at the text, each time one's introduced, you can draw some very, very important lessons from them. I think we get Doeg next week, so I'm going to look at Doeg and see what
all these names.
See why he's a bad example.
I guess I've heard that name once, but
yeah, this is when Saul's ruling, and he's a shepherd, I think, but he's an opportunist, and I know he goes and kills a whole load of priests. But anyway, we'll take a look at his story next time, and so if you want to do any preparation reading, so that you can come and challenge me, that's fine. I'll like a bit.
There is no knowledge to challenge. It's much better to challenge from ignorance.
Oh no. That's what I used to get in the jail all the time doing jail ministry. Some of them weren't. Some of them knew what they were talking about, but you used to get a lot of ignorant stuff going at you. But I tell you what, it sharpened the steel.
Yeah.
It was a great training place for me to.
You had to know your stuff.
Okay, I need to learn how to listen, and I need to learn how to fire back quickly, and not just because if you feel challenged, you tend to start losing it. And to be effective, to have a reason for the hope that lives in you is one thing, because that you can prepare. But in Colossians 4, we're told that we need to know how to answer each person, and the way that we answer them is important in that as well. Let me just look at that passage very quickly to close with. And just because someone's a preacher, believe you me, they don't necessarily know what they ought to know. Is that 1 Corinthians 8? Let your speech conduct yourselves wisely. That talks more of our walk, our life, which is what you were referring to earlier, toward outsiders. Conduct yourself wisely toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know for certain how you ought to answer each person. And that verb ought there it's a big verb. It's used a lot in Scripture because it really means to owe a debt. It means you owe a debt to the outsider to know how to answer their questions, which means you better be able to listen, okay, to what it is they're asking. But the seasoning with salt is referring to, or building on, the grace aspect there. Mm. Don't answer them by whapping them over the head with the Bible, or talking down to them arrogantly or condescendingly, which is what a lot of people do. But speak to them, get down to their level so that you can understand where they're coming from, and then do what Jesus did, bring them up to your level, spiritually speaking. Help them to that level. I believe that's incredibly important. Because if you have a knowledge, if you truly have a relationship with God, with the help of the Holy Spirit and through His Word, because you don't know God any other way. This is how He's revealed Himself. Mm-hmm. Okay? If you can do that, then I believe that God's going to use you in powerful ways. But if you feel threatened by people's questions, I mean, I get asked all kinds of questions. And if I don't know, I just say, well, I don't know the answer to that. You know, even if they do expect you to be perfect and sinless because they don't understand what Christianity really involves, it's okay to tell them, well, I don't know that. I tell you what, I'll look into it. You know, if it's something I should know, I'll check it up. But I want to be able to give you the right answer. You know, they're going to respect you a lot more for that than trying to make something up. But if you feel threatened and start arguing with them, you know, that's not going to win any battles. Mm-hmm. We used to go door knocking at areas of this city, this is 20 years ago. And every time we knocked the door of a Baptist, they were hostile to us. And I'm thinking, wow, why is that? Don't we have more in common than straight people who've got nothing to do with God? Well, it's because of the way that people have responded to them in the past. There have been a lot of battles, if you will. And that's a shame. Because I think the Bible talks about bringing people on in their faith. You know, if they've been taught to know God, but they don't know Him how they need to know Him, and aren't therefore in the right relationship with Him, we need to bring them onto a right relationship. Kind of like, who were the couple in the New Testament that went to Apollos? They heard him speak, and then afterwards, Priscilla and Aquila and Priscilla, wasn't it?
That's Ananias and Sapphira, but that wasn't it.
No, they needed that, but they didn't. No one got to them quick enough.
Yeah.
But you know, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. I've got way over time. Anyway, that was for free.